Hello, everybody, and welcome to the reality show brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK, where we apply the practical philosophy of objectivism to current events. Today, we have a great panel with us to discuss three topics today, which I think are sort of united by a single principle, but I want to see what you guys think of this. I want to welcome Michael Liebowitz, Morgan Carter, and Robert. Just Robert Nace here? Do we just have Robert, or is Amy there as well, Robert?
Just me today.
You are a force to be reckoned with just on your own. But so, folks, today the three topics we're going to start with the president of Iran, who I guess came before the UN, the United Nations yesterday to give one of his fantastic, I'm sure, brimming with human compassion and reason speeches before the UN. The fact that he's been allowed to even go to the UN, I think, is an interesting and unfortunate precedent. What do you guys think of this? Do you think it's justifiable that this guy gets to go in front of this body, that he's going to be, I think, head of the Human Rights Council fairly soon? Does this make any sense? What does it say about the UN that they would allow this to happen? It seems perfectly characteristic to me. Also, folks, their second topic today is about the fentanyl crisis. There's been a fourth wave, apparently, affecting people across demographics. What is the cause of this crisis? Over 100,000 people dying now a year because of fentanyl addiction, fentanyl overdoses. And how has this gotten so bad, and what could be done about it? I think objectivists will have a very unique answer to this. And apparently the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has predicted, I guess, through climate experts, that the temperature in London will reach 45 degrees Celsius. For those of us who don't understand Celsius in the United States, that's about what, 114 or 117 degrees. Sounds like a good sauna day to me, but he's saying it's a bad thing and that the infrastructure of London isn't prepared to do anything about it. And much more needs to be done about it. And of course, like every single one of these climate catastrophists, he has spent hundreds of thousands of miles expelling jet fuel into the atmosphere and contributing to the problem. Is that good? Is that right? Does that make any sense to you? We seem to have a confusion of values here, folks. So it's no surprise to me to see all these paradoxes living together at once. But let's deal with the president of Iran. And Robert, let me take you first about this. What do you think about this visit? It was highly limited. He couldn't visit any places outside of his hotel, but he took lots of meetings and he was able to probably spew propaganda on the 19th. I didn't see the speech, but what do you think this says about the UN?
I think it says what we've known all along. There are people who thought that, for example, Ayn Rand was being extremist when she denied the United Nations as a legitimate institution, and claimed that, well, they're willing to support some of the most brutal dictators in the name of human rights. Well, okay, it's 2023. Once again, she has proved right. I liked the response of Gianna Gancia. She's a member of the European Parliament. This is an Italian politician. And fortunately, she wrote this, and it's listed online. You can look in the record. She says, the appointment of Ali Bahraini, ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Iran and permanent representative of the United Nations to chair the 2023 United Nations Human Rights Council, is nothing more than a slap in the face, given the human rights situation of most Iranians, particularly women, and the repeated executions in the wake of ongoing protests in the country. As she goes on, and I could not agree more completely. It is outrageous. It's bad enough. You would think in a complicated world, okay, let's bring the Iranian government into the UN so we can talk to them, so we can negotiate, so we can try to move them in a better direction. But to appoint such a person to the Human Rights Council in a leadership position, well, it's good to know that it's not just the objectivists who are protesting this.
Michael, this sounds crazy. I mean, why not put the Butcher of Tehran, which is his nickname for standing in judgment over thousands of people whom he was responsible for murdering? Why not put the Butcher of Tehran at the head of the Human Rights Council? Why does that not make sense?
I'm actually not all that appalled by this. And the reason I'm not appalled by this is because exactly what Robert said. I have no expectations for the UN as a humanitarian organization or as a global leader or anything else. A few years back, Cuba was part of the Human Rights Council. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the United Nations has healthcare as a human right. I mean, they have no principle that they're operating under. It doesn't surprise me. This guy is just one of many tyrants and evil people that's spoken there. So, I mean, I wouldn't have him over my house. If he was coming to my house, I would be appalled. And if he was hanging out with friends of mine, I would certainly find them suspect. But I already find the United Nations suspect. So this doesn't diminish them in any way. Ultimately, if you're going to have these global organizations, you're going to have shady characters there. I don't know how you can get around it. At the beginning, I believe that the Security Council, the permanent members at the beginning were the Soviet Union and the United States. So right off the bat, I mean, Stalin was a bigger butcher than this guy, but yet the Soviet Union was allowed. So it's the guy's disgusting. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't lower my opinion of the UN at all, because my opinion, quite frankly, couldn't get any lower.
I mean, why do we keep expecting bodies that have to be divided on their essential values to be able to compromise and come together? Morgan, does that say something about our society and the way we look at values?
I think so. I mean, the number one thing that I always remember people saying about politics when I was growing up is that it was the art of compromise. It was basically if you were a principled person, it was in effect the art of giving up what you believed to someone else, no matter how reasonable it was what they believed. And that's essentially what the United Nations seems to be. It's a very pragmatic organization which is pursuing probably what it views as legitimate diplomatic goals, some of which might even be desirable, but which are immensely short-sighted. Foreign policy is a thing that's waged in the long term, after all. And the reason why well, I completely appreciate what Michael's saying. The reason why I do find this appalling is if you listen to the speech that the Butcher of Tehran gave whilst he was at the UN, he used it essentially as an opportunity to kick the United States in the teeth and to spit in the face of the West. He said that the Ukrainian war was the fault of the United States, completely excusing Russia for their actions, whilst telling a huge load of lies that he was in favor of peace at the same time that Iran is hosting a Russian defense delegation yesterday. It's just completely despicable stuff to see.
Unfortunately, there seems to be a lot of people in the political establishment, especially on the right, who would agree that the war in Ukraine is the fault of the United States.
Well, there probably are. And the thing is, the problem with Western nations is that they're never completely guilt-free in various things that happen in foreign policy in the last few decades. But the essential thing that's missed by that point, and I think it's completely dishonestly made by someone like the Butcher of Tehran, but perhaps there's a slight kind of innocence by some people on the right, though I doubt it. The thing that they're missing is the essential moral rectitude of a country like the United States, and the complete lack of moral rectitude for a country like Russia. And that's the huge difference.
I mean, it seems like these folks, the way in which we deal with them and they deal with us, if I were to personalize it, it's the way a malignant narcissist or sociopath deals with somebody with a conscience, and they play on that conscience to instill guilt and to gain power over them. But they themselves have no conscience. All they're looking to is exploit that guilt for gain. Does that seem like what this guy did in his speeches?
Yeah, I think so. The whole tone of his speech was triumphant, resentful, that he finally gets to stand up there and tell a hushed crowd what he thinks about the United States and about the West in general. That it is the fault of the West and who have attempted to Americanize the world. And that's why this conflict is going on, which is obviously just is a completely disgusting thing to go up there and say. It's true that organizations or people like George Bush, for example, wanted to kind of spread democracy to the world or whatever it is. But the idea that in somehow is a justification for what's going on in Ukraine is just completely ridiculous.
I think George Bush felt that freedom is writ large on the hearts of people, that everybody sort of wants it, but this doesn't seem to be true, does it? It seems like the majority of the world is inclined towards something else. In fact, they resent Americanism. And I think what makes America America is its rugged individualistic perspective that the rest of the world seems to resent. So, Robert, Michael said that the UN can't get any lower in his esteem, and I agree with that. And we talked about values and how impossible it is to merge these values. What happens when you compromise good values with bad values?
Well, you get our current political situation. Speaking of a compromise of good and bad values, let me mention the president. And I don't mean Joe Biden. I mean the former president. One of the few things I liked about Donald Trump, I did keep a list of the good things he did. And the way in which he addressed the United Nations, in which he could have done better, but he did not give them the credibility they so much wanted. And he sent Nikki Haley there, who to me was a hero in that regard. That's what's missing on the world stage, is for people to stand up and say, you are not the moral equivalent of the United States. You are not as good as the United States. Freedom matters. Liberty matters. The United States, whether we're actually living up to it, is the only country on principle based on that. It's why in the upcoming election, I can only have enthusiasm for Nikki Haley. I like Vivek on this as well. We need somebody to stand up and say, to hell with you, dictators. You have no place, not just in the United Nations, but at the conference table of any reasonable discussion. You have no right to be here. We need that. We saw that with Ronald Reagan. We saw that to some extent here and there, bits and pieces since then. But when did you have the last leader who said, this is a great country and to hell with the rest of the world? Even Trump was saying, make America great again. Well, to hell with that. America is great. And people like Bahraini have no right to consider themselves the moral equals, much less superior to this country in any way. And the solution is for us to stand up and say that.
Well, so we say it, Michael, but then what do we do about it? How do we make that value a concrete reality?
I may get myself into some trouble with an objectivist audience here, but there's two problems that can go either way when it comes to talking about this. One way is when people say, well, Iran is a horrible country, but America's done some bad things too, and they make a moral equivalence, which I don't think there is one, not even close. But the flip side of that is to pretend that America is right now a beacon of morality that can, for the world, or a beacon of freedom, and it simply isn't. I love the founding principles of this country. I think they're absolutely phenomenal. And in practice, it has led to the highest standard of living the world has ever known, even with its defects. But the fact of the matter is, right now we have a country that's over $30 trillion in debt. We have a war on drugs that we're going to talk about pretty soon with fentanyl that puts people in prison for consensual activities and leads to gang wars and all types of things. We've got 37% top tax brackets. I mean, there's a lot of problems with this country. And while I wouldn't put the onus on the United States or the West for Putin's behavior, because I think Putin's a barbarous dictator, but I don't think we can ignore the fact that NATO has an organization that was formed to fight the Soviet Union, which no longer exists, continues to push closer to Putin's border and just say, well, that's not a factor at all, and then not rule out allowing Ukraine. So I think my whole point in this rather lengthy diatribe is that on one hand, I think it's important to recognize the moral superiority of America to countries like Iran and to countries like Russia. But on the other hand, it's not to hold up America as if it's lived up to the ideals of its founding, because we certainly have not, and it's only getting worse.
It's very hard to claim moral superiority when you have a set of standards that you don't live up to. Iran lives up to its standards. It says exactly what it is and lives up to them. There's a moral consistency there. Although yes. I think most objectivists would agree with you in that respect. That America isn't living up to its principles. That's part of the problem. And that's, I think, where objectivists can lead people back and forward. We certainly have to look back on the principles that are right and improve upon them for the future. And I think objectivists have that solution. I also am not opposed to NATO coming right up to the butt of Putin and hemming him in and keeping him militarily confined. I know it makes him scared and he lashes out as a result because he's a sociopathic, paranoid freak. But he's still, I mean, I think he should be killed, not just contained. I think he should be ousted. He should be gone. We have every moral right to do that. But that's me. Morgan, what say you about what Michael just said, and the moral inconsistencies that the United States presents to the world makes it extremely hard for them to stand on a pedestal and say, we actually are better than you?
Yes. Well, I agree with that. I think Michael said a bit better what I was trying to get at, because what Ibrahim Raisi was getting at in his speech was, when he's saying that the West is trying to Americanize the world, what he's getting at are the kind of bad things that Western countries have done in recent years, like with George Bush and his ideas, for example. And he's using that as a kind of wedge to gain leverage when he's making these speeches. So I think that is very much true. I disagree with Michael slightly. I kind of want to ask Michael a question, and you set it up in a completely reasonable way, so I don't want to kind of jump on you. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to NATO, if Russia hadn't been the nation that it's been in the last 20 years, I think I would probably agree with you that NATO in effect would be outdated. But given Russia, even before Ukraine, given Russia, for example, waging the war in Georgia, would that not, do you not think, give Western nations justification to think, okay, Russia's going to be one of these malignant actors on the world stage in the next few decades, and we need to kind of keep this organization that we built up as a way of defending ourselves? I don't have a definite answer on that, but does that not, what do you think about that?
What I think is, if the United States, let me just bring it back to our country. If the United States was a country that actually lived up to its founding principles, if we were a country that stood for individual rights and individual liberty, and then we wanted to form alliances with other countries who did the same, I would say that'd be wonderful. I wouldn't care if you had 10 countries or 1,000 countries in such a thing, but that's not the case. We're not a country that's actually defending individual rights and individual liberty. NATO's not doing that either. So ultimately, I mean, what is the point of being involved in such an organization? The theory, well, Russia's going to expand, that reminds me of the domino theory. That ended up getting us involved in all types of conflicts, the Korean War, the Vietnam conflict. So it's a dangerous thing. And am I really willing to, would I be willing myself to enlist, go fight and die to protect Georgia, for instance? Is Georgia a beacon of liberty? Is Georgia a country defending individual rights where I want to step in and say, you know what, they're fighting for freedom, let me help them? Is Ukraine doing that? No. So why would I want Americans to put their lives at risk to fight for such a thing? If I thought Putin was going to attack America, let's go. Let's stop this animal in his tracks.
You're sort of on the conservative side that says, let's stop funding the Ukraine. It's a European problem. The Europeans should solve it.
Well, not on the conservative side, because I'm opposed to all initiation of force. And by definition, these things are being funded by initiation of force. So not only would I say don't fund Ukraine, but don't fund Israel and don't fund all the Arab states that we give money to. I don't think that we ought to be taxing our citizens, period, let alone to be sending money overseas.
Well, I agree with you there. Now, Robert, you said something. You said we should, declare the United Nations an illegitimate body. We should proclaim the values that the United States is supposed to represent. Though I don't think anybody in Washington or in the UN could do that at the moment. But let's suppose we get somebody out there who can. Now, how do you make these declarations action? How do you concretize them and make them go more beyond words?
I don't think you have to. Now, Michael's absolutely right. The degree to which we fall short would undercut those statements. But the statements need to be made. Those of us who remember the 1980s, whatever you think of Ronald Reagan, his words were actually more powerful than his actions because he was willing to take action to back them up. So it might be the case that we would have to back up our words, but it doesn't take that much. We don't have to, consistent with what Michael is saying, we don't have to go to war with other nations to make the point that we expect our rights to be respected. But we may have to take military action, something stronger, for example, than what we saw this week with the exchange of Iranian and American prisoners. We should not have allowed that to happen. And what would the Iranians have done if we had taken action to get those people back. It
What
might
about,
be,
but
it
Robert,
might
what
be
ab-
messy, it might be expensive, but what is the alternative?
that, I mean, that's a bit of a wider scope than the question I'm asking. I mean, I would say, would defunding the United Nations be a start? Would kicking them out of New York be a start? Would starting another organization that allows only what were considered free or semi-free countries to engage with each other, and leaving the rest to their own devices? Would that be a way of concretizing those principles?
Yeah, I think they would all be steps in the right direction. And there are existing organizations. Even NATO could be an organization under which we say, if you're not part of NATO, if you have not met the requirements to be part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, then you are not part of this conversation. I mean, it's a worldwide communication network. Our messages will be heard around the world. But absolutely, to say we don't sanction this, so we're not going to participate in it. You know, it's interesting to realize the United Nations would fall apart without the United States, who has always been the major sponsor, not to mention having the UN building in New York City. It's more worldwide now, but what credibility would it have? They would become the Banana Republic organization, like this latest group of Russia and China and a few other nations who are playing like they are part of the world stage. They are nothing compared to the Western economies. And the UN would be nothing without the United States.
Well, then I say that this should be these words should be translated into action. And if you say these words and still send an ambassador to the UN, you're just practicing the same hypocritical values that you've been practicing for the last 130 years. So I say defund the UN, kick it out of New York, and then maybe we gravitate to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and say, these are the values that we basically want to represent. We will ally ourselves, economically, open our doors economically to these countries, close our doors economically to the ones who murder their own citizens and spread terror and wage war on other countries. Does that sound good to you, Michael, or are you skeptical?
No, it does sound good. When I think of NATO, I think France with its minimum wage laws and all its socialistic policies. In most of the countries in NATO that I can think of anyways, and I'm no expert, but they have universal health care, for instance, socialized health care. They're so antithetical to the principles that I believe in that I just don't see it.
Yeah, and apparently starting to rebel against the United States in its own way. France is trying to establish itself as a bigger player on the world stage, it seems, presently, and of course that's a little scary. Before we go on to the next topic, I have some super chats. Roland Harvath with I think that's 5 Swiss francs, and he's 45-degree British summer. Sure, but that's already in Fahrenheit. Well, Morgan, you would know that. Mark Twain said the coldest winter he ever spent was a summer in San Francisco, but I'm sure he never went to the UK when he wrote that. Jonathan Honig with $10. Thank you, Jonathan, for watching. And Kiana Pellegrino with $1. Thank you, Kiana, but keep that buck. It's better served for you too. So, folks, fentanyl. Fentanyl is an epidemic in the United States of America. Over 100,000 people a year are dying from overdoses, and it seems to be spreading. It's growing. It's a contagion. The right says we need to contain the border. Probably we need to send more ATF folks over there and whatever alphabet soup agency over there to fight a military incursion against the cartels, which I think they made powerful the way Prohibition made the mob powerful. That's a topic we will get to here. What's the cause of this crisis? First of all, Robert, what do you think the cause of this opiate addiction is? I have my suspicions. I want to see if they're the same as yours.
Yeah, the cause is that people feel bad and they want to feel better. There's no single cause for this, but at root, the problem is bad philosophy. Incorrect, irrational beliefs about reality and human nature, and what it takes to live a happy, successful life. People want to feel better. They don't believe that living a good, virtuous, rational life is going to make that happen. And this is only going to get worse, not necessarily because culture is getting worse, but for the same reason that fentanyl is on the scene. technology, mass production, distribution is going to make these kinds of drugs more and more available. It will become easier to synthesize them, whether in a mobile home in a trailer park or in your kitchen sink. It's going to come down to philosophy. The reason this is happening is because it can happen. And because people don't have compelling enough reasons not to fall into this. If anybody's seen the Woody Allen film Sleeper, if you remember the orgasmatron, this machine you could walk into that would give you this experience without having to go through all the mess of actual sexuality. This is going to be more and more a thing with neural links in your brain. You can press a button and say, give me joy, give me happiness, give me adventure. The fact that unfortunately overdosing on it kills you is just the side effect. But the fact that so many people are seeking an escape from reality, that's a problem of culture and ultimately a philosophy.
So we have a dearth of philosophy and ethics and a rudderlessness with respect to values in our country, and we have a violence problem now that since these drugs are on the black market, it introduces a great deal of violence, particularly cartels, which have become a major influencer in the border towns, and China now able to produce these drugs, pass them through the cartels and over to our border. Michael, what do you think the solution to this is? Because nobody's going to get this philosophy in the next 75 or 100 years, but is there anything we could do immediately to help solve this crisis that's hitting us now?
Well, as far as why people use drugs, I think Robert is spot on. But the reason we have a fentanyl problem is quite simple. It's because of prohibition. And I actually just interviewed a guy yesterday, Jeffrey Singer from the Cato Institute, on this very topic of fentanyl. And he called it the iron law of prohibition, that whenever you outlaw a substance, it just gets worse. And
for which there is a market, still.
Yes. Yeah. So what happens is, in the case of fentanyl, you outlaw heroin. And not only did they outlaw heroin, but then they've put pressure on doctors to not prescribe over-the-counter prescription drugs like Oxycontin, Percocets, and things like that. So what ends up happening now, you go to your dealer on the street. And when you go to your dealer on the street, you have no idea what you're buying. You don't know what the dosage is of the heroin. You don't know what it's mixed with. Fentanyl is much cheaper. It's also much easier, I guess, to smuggle over here than heroin because it's smaller. So you end up with products laced with fentanyl, the milligrams you don't know, and you end up with overdoses. Recently there was a finding that this drug, and I don't remember the name of it, but it's a decongestant. And the FDA, after 50 years, figured out that this thing does not work as a decongestant. And now they're telling people. Now, pseudoephedrine does work as a decongestant. But a few years back, I think 2006, they discovered that pseudoephedrine was being used to make meth. So they made it so now if you want pseudoephedrine, you have to go behind the counter in the drugstore, and then they take down your name. They know who you are because they figure out how much you're buying. All done in the name to stop meth. Since then, I believe it's overdoses due to meth have gone up 1,500% since the government passed the law to make people safe for meth. And it's the same thing over and over again. It happened with alcohol when they went through prohibition. It's happening with drugs, and people just simply will not learn. Apart from it being a gross rights violation to tell people what they can and can't ingest, it's woefully inept and inefficient and will never work.
Yes, I think we can say that the border towns that are owned by the cartels are the responsibility of the right and their war on drugs.
Absolutely.
which has done nothing but increase drug use and more importantly, increase the violence associated with drug use. But then there's this issue, Morgan. I was just reading an article in the New York Post recently that said when you're walking around New York City, it smells like pot everywhere. I know it's like this when I'm working in British Columbia, Vancouver, British Columbia, where pot is legalized. They have cannabis stores everywhere. It smells like pot everywhere. Now that would lead one to believe that if you legalize these drugs, it's going to increase the epidemic of drug use, not decrease it. What do you think about that? And does that matter?
Goodness. I mean, on that particular point, I would just have to hold my hands up and say, I don't know. I've been to Vancouver once, and I'd say British Columbia is one of the most beautiful places in the world. I flew into Kelowna, which is the kind of wine country outside of Vancouver. And I was driving into Vancouver with one of my old friends, and she asked me where in the city I had booked our hotel. And I said East Hastings, which if anyone knows.
Yeah, you're in Zombie Town, brother.
Yeah, if anyone knows anything about Vancouver, you do not want to book a hotel in East Hastings, but I had never been, so I had no idea. And it was one of the most shocking experiences of my life, was driving through East Hastings. Now, luckily, our hotel was in the one little corner of East Hastings that wasn't so bad, but it was a mile, maybe 2 miles of tents, people who just unfortunately looked like they were the Walking Dead.
So for anybody who doesn't know, I do want to jump on this because I've worked in Vancouver for years and years and years. It's one of the most beautiful cities. You go over that Burrard Bridge, from the airport, and you're like, this skyline is astounding. It's a beautiful, beautiful city. You go over that bridge on Burrard, and you keep going down that street, and if you turn on Main and you get to Hastings at any point, you're going to see that the entire homeless and drug addicted population is concentrated in about a 3 square block area right outside of Chinatown. And it is horrific. Like it's literally 5 people deep on the sidewalk, drug markets and other markets. The homeless sell their wares there. Fights, stabbings, murders, overdoses happening on a daily basis there. I actually Airbnb'd an apartment right there over an Irish pub right on the edge of Hastings there, and there was something going on every day. Walking home was a very interesting trip for me. But anyway, go on. Would this problem get worse if things were if these kinds of illicit drugs were made legal?
I don't know. I'm suspicious of the idea of gateway drugs. I think there are things like that, but my experience is that a lot of people who are younger treat weed as essentially like alcohol. It's that kind of casual for them. And it's not therefore a gateway into things which are harder. Now, I might be completely wrong about that. That's just anecdotal. I do know people who have gone into harder drugs, and that I think is for different reasons than they played around with weed or something like that. The thing about fentanyl, and I think its ultimate cause, I think Robert was right that there's something philosophical. I think I don't want to be unkind to saying this, but I think it's essentially people who on some level want to die. I watched a documentary about fentanyl as well, and it was taken in East Hastings, and they interviewed a drug dealer who dealt fentanyl. And what he said was, as soon as people got whiff of people who had died from one particular type of fentanyl, like I think it was the green fentanyl at that time, he suddenly would get a rush of people coming in asking for the green fentanyl because they knew that must be the good one, even though they knew that it was the one that was killing people. And as soon as there was a new one that was more powerful and more dangerous, people would rush in and try and get that one. So I think at a deep level, the fentanyl crisis is caused by people not valuing their own lives. And I think that's the kind of deeper cause than maybe if other gateway drugs are available.
Well, I agree with you. I don't think pot is a gateway drug. I think your philosophy is a gateway drug. Either it stands at the gates and holds those things at bay because you value life and you value experiencing the moment, or you don't, and you need some kind of fix to give you a sense of that, some kind of emotional sense of that. Interesting, folks. I, like Michael, think that drugs should be legal. Of course, now I see libertarians are pushing psilocybin, which is becoming legal in certain states now. So we're certainly upping the ante. But does this mean somebody's going to be driving under the influence of mushrooms, like on the same highway as me? This sort of freaks me out a little bit. Robert, you want to say something?
Yeah, I absolutely want to say something about that, because I believe that simultaneously with decriminalizing and ultimately legalizing drugs needs to be enforcement of any crimes that are then associated with that. Reckless endangerment is an objective crime, whether it's caused by drunk driving or driving while stoned. And it's not that hard, especially in this day of cameras everywhere, to show that somebody was driving while impaired, and not just because we found a liquor bottle in his car, but by his actual driving, by his actual performance. I think the solution, it may well be you legalize marijuana, more people smoke marijuana. I have plenty of experience with marijuana. I'm at a point in my life now where the smell of it just gives me a headache for philosophical reasons, because, man, I just hate that people make themselves stupid on purpose. But if that happens, that's what happens. I don't think the solution is legalization. I think that's something that's got to happen. I'm fighting for it. I fought for smoking in bars, which they made illegal in Michigan, which I find almost as offensive as smoking dope in bars. I still don't understand why people smoke cigarettes, much less smoke marijuana, but do what you will. The solution is going to be philosophy. If I could give a quick quote from the lady of the hour and Ayn Rand in the New Left. Nowadays, the new version is called Return of the Primitive. In her speech, Apollo and Dionysus at the Fort Hall Forum. I think everybody will have heard that, but anybody who hasn't, it's one of the best speeches she ever gave. And an excerpt from the speech, she says, "Is there any doubt that drug addiction is an escape from an unbearable inner state, from a reality one cannot deal with, from an atrophying mind one can never fully destroy?" And then she makes the point, if Apollonian reason were unnatural to man and Dionysian intuition brought him closer to nature and truth, the apostles of irrationality would not have to resort to drugs. Happy, self-confident men do not seek to get stoned. She says so much more in that talk. It's a must listen. And I absolutely agree. Again, the solution, yes, you need to end the war on drugs. Yes, you need to legalize drugs, including any that can be shown to be consumed without becoming an objective danger to the people around you. But the real solution is going to be philosophy. That's how you legalize drugs and get more people to say, yeah, I don't want to do that to myself.
So, Michael, are you on board with that? You're on board for legalizing drugs, but also making enforcement of reckless endangerment.
Sure. When I said that legalizing drugs is the solution, what I mean is it's the solution to these overdoses. It would significantly cut down on overdoses. It's not, I don't think it's going to cut down on use. I don't think it's going to expand use either. And as far as driving, if someone's going to drive under the influence, they're already doing it. I drove under the influence all the time. When I was a teenager, I'd get drunk, I'd go driving. It's just what I did. But the one thing I will say, and I agree with Robert ultimately that the solution is proper philosophy. However, there's literally billions of people in this world that aren't drug addicts that also are not objectivists. So it's not just that, these people are using drugs because they have a bad philosophy, because the flip side of that would be, well, what about the people that don't use drugs? Does that mean that they have a good philosophy? And I don't think it necessarily means that. People get off of drugs, but they go to AA and NA, which I think is a reprehensible philosophy, but it does work for some people. Don't
you think it works? I encouraged a friend of mine to go into AA because I saw that he had no structure, no mental, philosophical, ethical structure in his life. And that provided it for him. He's an atheist and he had to deal with some of the issues with respect to God, but it gave him a structure, a way of looking at the world that enabled him for the first time to be able to see himself as a responsible, independent human being. And I think that's regardless of what philosophy you pick out, it has to incorporate those notions.
I don't disagree. And like I said, I ultimately agree with Robert. I just, a lot of times, and listen, I consider myself an objectivist, don't get me wrong, but I've come across where it sounds as if like people will say, well, you can't be happy, you can't be successful unless you have the objectivist philosophy. But then you can point to somebody and you say, well, look, this guy's wealthy, he's got a happy family, and he's not an objectivist. Now, my response to that would be, well, the principles that made him a success are the same principles that are in objectivism. Unless it's just luck, which is also possible. But, hard work, dedication, productivity, honesty, integrity, those are the principles that lead to success, whether somebody's an objectivist or not. I just happen to have come across this objection on a feed the other day to objectivism, and I don't want to fall into the trap of sounding as if there's
Michael,
no way you can do it without objectivism.
Michael's making an important point here. And sometimes, as objectivists, we say, objectivism is right. It's true. And we believe this and we agree with that. Therefore, it's the good philosophy. And therefore, every other philosophy is bad. And that makes it sound like equally bad, equally useless. And that's just not how philosophy works.
Right.
So yes, I absolutely agree with Michael.
Well, Robert, please, that sounds like such a good point. Like like that. I wish I would have put it that way because
Well, you
you're right.
did, and I appreciate you saying it.
But can you explain that? Just elaborate. I don't mean to, Mark.
Well,
you're supposed to be
if
asking
you
a
hold a
question.
philosophy, if you hold a philosophy, for example, that has some respect for individual rights, that has some respect for virtue in your life, that says, I need to take care of myself and my family, my people, we would call that productivity and independence and responsibility. But if you hold a philosophy that has actual virtues, yes, you're going to do better than somebody who's an out and out nihilist. Even though it's an objectivist, we can say, oh, yeah, but you believe that for social compact reasons, or you believe that for religious reasons, and therefore your philosophy is bad. Well, again, not all philosophies are equal. And you're making a good point. We could do a whole show on it, but I think it's valuable to get that in.
Yeah. Not all philosophies are equal. That's true, but I think objectivism comes as close as you can possibly get to enabling you to have the best life possible. It's certainly a pro-life. Any philosophy that's life-oriented, as many philosophies are not life-oriented. That will help you. I push objectivism because I'm an objectivist. We're on an objectivist channel. Objectivism is a fringe philosophy in the eyes of many people. Many people think erroneously that Rand has been discredited by academia, that her concepts have been completely blown out by legitimate philosophers. This is untrue. And if objectivism could spread further and somebody adopts some other rational philosophy that nonetheless holds the same virtues and the same focus on life, I would cheer them on and say, good for you. You don't like the objectivist language or things about objectivism you don't like. You like the rational, virtuous elements of it. Good for you. More power to you.
Can I say something real quickly before we move on? Because it goes to your point as far as academics or other people disqualifying or refuting Ayn Rand. I put out an open challenge to debate anybody that thinks that they've got a good critique of Ayn Rand. On my podcast, I've had a professor, a journalist, and a philosophy student, all who thought that they were supreme critics of Ayn Rand or thought by others to be so. None of them even got her philosophy right, let alone had a good critique. They literally, each of them misstated what she thought and then proceed to criticize what the thing that they're misstating.
There's a lot of intellectual masturbation out there. They form an idea of somebody in their head and they violently masturbate to that. And that's what they think objectivism is. Sorry about that, guys. But I find it out there.
That was awesome.
I find it out there in social media. But hey, I'm a partner here. Objectivism is a partner. Let's get into this together. A couple of super chats here. Nick Ortega, member for 9 months. Legalize drugs. It's a violation of individual rights. Michael, you said that. Catherine with $1.99, celebrating another turn around the sun. Second day. Oh, I guess that's her birthday. Happy birthday, Catherine. Very good. Gail Parker, $2. Nick Ortega. Where am I? It's just screwed up here. Nick Ortega, legalizing drugs will curtail cartel violence. I wanted to say that too, Michael. Yes, it would make overdoses a thing of the past for sure, but it would definitely take the violence out of the transactions. So you people on the right who have your war on drugs and are baffled as to why the cartels control border towns and can send people with impunity into the United States as drug mules, well, you made it happen. You made it happen with prohibition. And the way you take the rug out from under those vicious cartels, you defund them, my friend, by making an actual market, by stopping this stupid thing called prohibition. And then they have to compete against the market and they can't use their force anymore. A Kindred Army member for 16 months. Thank you, Nick. Good thoughts, gentlemen. Thank you. Apollo Zeus with £2. Was Ayn Rand right on everything? Yes, no. So there are a number of things, and we've had tons of panel discussions about the various things that many objectivists disagree with her on. The morality of being gay, for example, I think was a particular problem that a relative of mine had with Ayn Rand. And I don't think any objectivist would say today. I think back when Rand said something about the immorality, and Robert, you may know more about this than I. There might have been around the time when science thought being gay was a choice, and she made or she thought it was immoral or something like that. And so she made her comments with respect to that, as opposed to, I think, the newer data, which suggests that, this isn't really, I know my sexuality doesn't seem like a choice to me. It just seems like something that I have to deal with as it is. Robert, do you have anything to say about?
There's a great episode right on the Ayn Rand Center UK channel. Was Ayn Rand wrong on homosexuality? Our producer might put a link in the chat, but you can do a search and find it. At the same time, and they point out in this episode, Ayn Rand had friends who were gay. Her husband's brother was gay. She did not act in any way badly to such people. So it was more of a cultural phenomenon. It was more certain aspects of how she saw it played out in the culture. And yes, I certainly feel differently about that, but those thoughts, she never made them part of her philosophic writings. It came up, for example, in a Q&A at the Ford Hall Forum.
And I have to say something too about maybe some of the issues that people have with homosexuality, and some of its in-your-face, very promiscuous attitudes. I think some of that also has to do with prohibition. Pushing people into the closet distorts your value system. It doesn't allow you to live out your values the way you want to. So how could you not do perverse things and seek out some of the values that I think I would consider unfortunate in any straight person? But now that it's normalizing, I hope, in the minds of most people in America, people can come out and have relationships and be with each other in the street, love each other as legitimate members of society without feeling they're crushed or oppressed. Do you think that has to do with some of the cultural phenomena that people oftentimes associate with
Sure. We're reacting to culture more than we are to the idea. And there's good reason for that. I don't think that that's unreasonable. And I think the question that Apollo Zeus asks, was Ayn Rand right on everything? He puts up the devil horn. So obviously he's playing with us a little bit there. She was right about everything that she said philosophically. What she said about everything else, I think she was right about just about everything else too. But my concern is her philosophic ideas and what they do for my life, what they can do for our culture, for one another. My short answer to that is, yeah, she was right on everything that matters.
Right. That doesn't mean you have to pattern your life after her ideal people and do what they did in order to be right. You can have your own version of that, folks. Any final comments on this?
I do for yes. What Robert just said is that I've been on social media now on Facebook, I think, for about 6 months, and the stuff that I see from you, Robert, and it's just, you to me epitomize living the actual life of what an objectivist should be.
Well,
not making the I love to argue, I love to debate, but you actually just really seem to just put it out there that this is about enjoying my life, being happy, and doing what I love to do. And it really is, and it's inspiring. I love when your posts, you come across my feed. It's great.
Well, that's very kind of you, but I'll just say my selfish interest in this, your selfish interest in this, about all these ideas is, what can I do in my life with these ideas? So if you see any of that in me, that's a great compliment, but that's what I want for everybody out there. This is not about winning arguments. It's not about convincing yourself of things. These are tools. This philosophy is the owner's manual for life that we should have been given at the hospital when we were born. It's for your own sake.
Well, God forbid you say that happiness is achievable, that you actually have a system of thought that can help you achieve that. It's not guaranteed, folks. Nothing is guaranteed in life, but you certainly stand a much better chance of being happy if you hold your rational self-interest and happiness as a high value. So please do that. I want people to understand that too. I'm a teacher, I'm an acting teacher, and it's my favorite thing in the world to do is passing on something to somebody else that makes their eyes light up in liberation for the first time. It's like they're being born. And I want people out there listening to this philosophy to be born again, right? You've had your first time. The world's had its way with you. Now you have your way with the world. Morgan, do you have anything final comments to add to this conversation? It became sort of, it diverged off its main course, but very, very fruitful.
Yeah. I think when people first encounter objectivism, sometimes because of Rand's view, or the view held typically amongst objectivists, that kind of truth can be objective, truth can be an absolute, and their admiration for Rand's philosophy. It can seem, and there probably are people who act as if everything Rand ever said was correct. Nothing could be wrong. And if someone were to point out something that she said that was wrong, people probably get a bit defensive. I think it should probably just be articulated that what Rand said is not by definition the truth. Things are true if they correspond to reality. And I admire Rand immensely because I think she was singularly brilliant in articulating things which were true and which are distinct to her thought. But she can say things which are wrong all the time. I was reading, which doesn't say things which are wrong all the time, but she very much could do. I was reading her book on nonfiction writing, and she makes a point in there that she says there is no such thing as objectivism, that abstractions per se don't exist. And I actually don't think that's true. And I think she's kind of exaggerating to make a point there. I think she's trying to get people to not think rationalistically and just understand ideas as tools. And I've heard Keith Lockett say a little bit about that. But I think per se, if that were truly what she would, stood for and believed, I think that's false. I think it contradicts other things she had to say, which is why I think she's kind of making a point. But let's say Rand truly believed that. What does it matter that she's wrong about that? If we were to discover something that she said was false, then ultimately that doesn't really matter. If what you're concerned with is what's true, and if that's what you're building into your worldview is what's true.
One of the things I hate about people online is when they call me a Randian. I just want to kick him in the teeth. I'm not a Randian, I'm an objectivist. I've seen principles that I think are right. They're good, they correspond, as you said, Morgan, to the facts of reality. And they make me a more happy person. When I pursue them consistently, I'm happier. So that's what I am. That's what I pursue. I pursue a philosophy of life. I don't pursue a woman. I don't pursue, even though I hold many of her concepts, I admire them, and I admire the mind that put them there. I don't follow a woman or a man. I follow my own mind. So I had to qualify that. Otherwise, I think I was going to get attacked. So in the final moments today, we got to talk about Sadiq Khan and his fear that summers in the UK will be 45 degrees Celsius pretty soon, and that they have to do something about it. Of course, he has to fly all over the world, spewing jet fuel into the atmosphere, making the problem worse, according to his own cronies. What say you? I want to go with our resident Brit here. What do you think about this character and his spastic proclamations?
I don't think very much of Sadiq Khan. I don't think very much of him because of his principles. I don't think very much of his behavior since he's been mayor of London. As for whether the UK is going to reach 45 degree summers in the future, although certainly the summers have been getting notably warmer in the UK the last few years. In Edinburgh, in cold Scotland, it reached 31 degrees last year. And believe me, we're not built to handle it at all. There's something that's a problem in Europe in general, is that very few buildings actually come with AC. I don't know why. But
this is true, and our apartment in Paris has no AC, sans AC, me not likey.
Going to the US is just a revelation, because every building you walk in seems to be a cool kind of 16 degrees, and it's lovely. Whereas here in Edinburgh, the buildings are old and there's not much AC, and that really sucks. So it does seem to be the case that the summers in the UK are getting hotter. Whether it's going to reach 45, I don't really know, but it's a huge hypocrisy for Sadiq Khan. People who make these kind of beliefs, and Sadiq Khan's advocating, net zero and all this kind of stuff, that they then go and fly around the world like all this, spewing out tons of carbon dioxide. If someone like Greta Thunberg were doing that, she actually, to be fair to her in terms of internal consistency, tries to go sailing and to minimize her footprint. I could actually understand if she were doing things like that, because she could kind of say like, oh, the net output of my work would be that carbon emissions are going to fall or something like that. Sadiq Khan doesn't have any of that. He's the mayor of London, so I think very little of him, and this just lowers him
at one time a very prestigious position that seemed to actually hold the liberties of Londoners very sacred, and stood oftentimes against, I think, tyranny, for my poor understanding of that region. Michael, what do you say to this?
I just found one thing interesting that this guy had to say. And he talked about, there are people that with vested interests that disagree with us. And that's a tactic that I absolutely hate, when people pretend as if nobody can honestly disagree with me. If you're disagreeing with my position, you're not mistaken, you're corrupt. And that drives me crazy. And it's not to say that people can't be corrupt and that's why they disagree, but that's just not my go-to. I don't just assume someone who disagrees with me is a vested interest. And ultimately, he doesn't really believe that, I don't think, anyway. I think it's just a tactic that politicians
might I add that he has vested interests as well, and there are vested interests who want this climate change to go through as well.
Yeah, it's like when a politician out run for the hills whenever you hear them say, there's these common sense solutions. I know it's all BS after that.
Yeah, indeed. If they were common sense, you wouldn't need force to push them on people.
Right.
Robert, what say you to this character, Sadiq Khan? I say vote him out.
Yeah. These simplistic solutions, and they can talk about a lot of technology. They can talk about 9 things we need to do about climate change. They're simplistic in the sense that they don't take into account the requirements of human survival and human flourishing. Now, I think that too many of us on the other side make the same mistake in that we are dismissive of all of the claims of science. And for good reason. We see how it's tied into government funding. Nobody gets paid money to say nothing's wrong. Everybody gets paid money to say something's wrong. I get that. But I think more of us need to take the approach of Alex Epstein and say that even to the extent there is any human impact on the climate, the right thing to do is to continue to focus on human flourishing. If we can do that, if we can start having that kind of discussion, that nuanced discussion, more than just denial, but denial that there's a crisis, denial of the crisification of it, then I think we have a chance of beating some of this down. In the meantime, yeah, this guy needs to go pound sand. But if we want to be better advocates, I think we need to crack open a copy of Fossil Future, or the earlier book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and take a clue from Alex Epstein. Don't be simplistic about it.
All right, so let's throw Sadiq Khan off the Tower Bridge. And it just goes to show you that one rational person in the world can really change the conversation. Alex Epstein has had a great influence on lots of people in this argument. He's actually slowed down the momentum of the climate change fanatics out there, who I think are certainly putting us under the yoke of an anti-life, anti-human philosophy. And people are starting to look up and say, wait a minute, I don't think this is rational. Maybe my life does matter. And maybe there's a way we can deal with the climate crisis in another way that doesn't involve politics, but involves fossils and involves the exploration of other types of fuel that have been outlawed by the government. Maybe the government isn't such a good way to go for this type of solution. And thank God for him. Folks, we have some upcoming, I have some announcements here. 10 p.m. UK time, Cutting Edge with Lee Pearson, Rob Stubblefield, Steve Richens, and special guest Ray Shelton on what is gender. Ooh, that will be a scintillating topic, because I want to know too. I'm a little confused over the last few months about what is gender. Also, my reality check will be coming out right after this show, so check it out. Go to my YouTube channel or go to my Twitter, where you'll find it. It's going to be on immigration. Is immigration a right? Well, find out from my perspective. I'm sure some objectivists will disagree. I'm sure some will agree. That's the beauty of being in a community of thinking people who use their own minds for judgment. Well, folks, it's been great. The panel's been fun. I've learned a lot from you. I hope the people out there like this content. If you do, like, subscribe, pass it on. Reason needs to metastasize across the face of the earth to turn back the tides of chaos, folks. And while you're doing that, please remember to always check your premises. Peace.